Joining us again for our afternoon session. For those of you that are just joining us for the first time here or online, we have four different Christian traditions that we're going to be discussing and kind of exploring here. Their interpretations of Jesus' sermon on the bread of life in John 6. And to start us out this afternoon, we have Bruce Beck, who's going to be representing the Eastern Orthodox Christian tradition. So we're going to go till about, let's see, so Bruce, with your 5+ minute kind of summary of your paper. And again, for those of you who are just joining us, for the first time, each person here in the group has written a short paper on their Christian tradition, their interpretation of the Bread of Life sermon, and circulated that earlier. So everyone in this group has read each other's papers. Each of the kind of conversation leaders that we'll have here will give a short kind of overview of their papers and the big takeaways. And then we're going to open up for the group to be able to ask each other questions about those to better understand their tradition. So first, Bruce Beck will be leading off, and then we'll be having our kind of group conversation that we're going to be ending at about 5 after 4 is our total time for this particular tradition. So take it away, Bruce.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with all of you again. So yesterday Mark and I were having a conversation about what traditions we use when we are trying to be traditional, and he was remarking how I tend to go way back, and so Peter does this as well. So I'm starting with our 4th century patristic father, St. John Chrysostom, and he and I were talking that there's the church fathers for the Orthodox Church are they're a touchstone for us, meaning that we want to our reflex is to turn to the left, to the back, and take a look at what's come before us before we start working on whatever our work is. And so he has been a constant source of insight for me, and I also want to begin by saying that what I found in his commentary, his homily on this passage, John 6, was actually a little ironical in that I was expecting to find a very full sort of sacramental treatment of the homily, and he went off and said that this is my first point, is that I am the bread of life has 2 possible meanings. It could be literal, he says, meaning it's his body, the bread of life, or it could be that it is receiving his word, that his word is the bread. And then John refers to John 8:51, where Jesus says exactly that the person who keeps my word has eternal life. So he's making an equivalency between the bread, receiving the bread of life, and receiving or keeping the word. And then there's a third abiding that we'll actually talk about tomorrow when we talk about John 14, where you have again the keeping my commandments, and then both Christ and the Spirit will abide in us. So there's a lot of abiding in the text that we're dealing with in these 2 days. I want to jump from his observation about the keeping the word, his word, and then receiving the bread of life, to notice that the structure of the Byzantine divine liturgy, while theologically it's understood to be seamless, it's a whole. It's not divided into parts. It's all sort of one piece. Many scholars will look at its 2 largest parts as the liturgy of the Word, and then the liturgy of the divine gifts. And John has typified that in saying that the bread of life is both Word receiving word as well as receiving Christ, his body itself. My paper took a little bit of a turn that I didn't expect, in that, which is now that my third observation here, is that I found that I was seeing the word signs in the larger context of John, and that so allow me to kind of go through this sort of series of symbols. As we know, the chapter starts with him multiplying the bread and the fish, and that the multitude is fed, and that he says when the people follow him that you came looking for bread again, and that they did not see the signs. They didn't see him as the signs. This is actually a very old trope. It's not just with Jesus. Deuteronomy 8, I think it's 8:3 or 8:6, already says that that God says, "I tested you in the wilderness so that you would know that humanity does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." And then, as I said in my paper, Isaiah 55 says, "Why do you labor and strive, for that which does not satisfy?" Because it's talking about water and bread there as well. So there's already this well-established trope of the difference between the physical and the spiritual, that which is divine. But there's a second. What I was really struck with, though, was the typology. What seemed to be driving his comparison, at least first, was like the manna descending, he descended. It seems that the what's in Greek, the katabasis, the descent, was really what he was trying to emphasize. But unlike the bread, which was bread, the manna, he was in fact a living person in the Trinity. And so that's why he can call himself the living bread, unlike the other bread. And I was connecting that to, so his invitation to eat the bread of life is really a continuation of how John starts, the prologue, where he says that the Word became flesh, which is the same word that he's using in John 6, eat my flesh. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. And so the dwelling among us in John 1 seems to have changed in John 6 to dwelling in us by eating his flesh. So there's all of these amazing, beautiful symbols and typologies that are all kind of being used by Jesus. And the people would have understood this. That's the culture that they were in. So I want to end with this idea of sign, in that in verse 26 of chapter 6, I think he gave us a clue about what the problem was. He said to the people that you came looking for bread again, which I gave you yesterday, and you didn't see the sign. It seems that the Eucharistic meal as more than food is a major message that's in the pericope. And so as a Christian rite, it is both physical as well as a experience of faith. And he left us, and he in fact gave us this sign. I mean, we didn't make up this ritual. He commanded us to actually see his body as the bread and see his blood as a cup, and to do that in his memory. And so the Orthodox call in the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, the call to the chalice is with fear, or I would translate with awe, with faith, and with love draw near. It seems that the ability to see the Eucharistic gifts as more than just bread and wine is essential, and that it merges with our awe of what God has done, our faith and desire for Him, and our love not only for God but love for one another seem to be the prerequisites to approach the cup. We could talk about how memory, the word memory, was different in the ancient world than it is today, but there's not time for that. I will end by just reading an excerpt from one of the Eucharistic prayers that is a prayer of preparation, and it was in my paper, the last page. But I want to give a feeling for sort of the multivalency of the symbol of bread and wine. In other words, it's not. We've been asking this morning, does it heal? Does it sanctify? And the Orthodox, they just pile it on. You can't count all of the benefits. And so this will give you a little feeling for this. So after, this is the second half of this prayer, after it's already been talking about repentance and trying to deal with one's unworthiness. And so the sentence is sort of, your all holy body and precious blood. And then here come the benefits. For the sanctification, enlightenment, and strengthening of my weak soul and body, for the relief from the burden of my many sins, for my preservation against all the snares of the devil, for victory over my sinful and evil habits, for the mortification of my passions, for obedience to thy commandments, for growth in thy divine grace, and for the inheritance of thy kingdom. For it is not with a careless heart that I approach thee, O Christ my God, but I come trusting in thine infinite goodness and fearing, lest I may be drawn afar from thee and become the prey of the wolf of souls. Wherefore I pray thee, O Master, who alone art holy, that thou wouldst sanctify my soul and body, my mind and heart and reins, and renew me entirely. Implant in my members the fear of thee. Be thou my helper and guide, directing my life in the paths of peace, and make me worthy to stand at thy right hand with thy saints. Through the prayers and intercessions of thine Immaculate Mother, of the bodiless servitors, of the Immaculate Powers, and all the saints who from all the ages have been well-pleasing unto you. Amen. And that prayer is attributed to St. John Chrysostom, I believe. That's it. Amen. Remember? Amen. Amen.
Thoughts, questions for Bruce?
You and I were chatting just briefly before you started. I mean, you wrote one of the strong tenets of Eastern Orthodoxy is to approach the sacrament with wisdom.
Yeah.
Talk to us about that. What does that mean? I mean, someone just said, "Are you worthy?" What does it mean?
Yeah, we were talking about it, and I think it's one of those wonderful paradoxes in that the best, the one method of becoming worthy is to confess that one is not worthy. Mm-hmm. And so in that confession, one says, in fact, one of the Eucharistic communion prayers is, let me not be like the person that you invited to the banquet that was not clothed properly. Let me not be cast out, but rather let me be clothed and be allowed, to stay. And so these prayers are recognizing the kind of precariousness of the invitation. And one of the deep motifs of all Orthodox prayers is the sort of almost undertone of, Lord, have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy. There's this sense of confidence but carefulness. And so there's that. But then there is, in fact, a place where you count yourself out, meaning, you're wanting to go to church, and then you have an argument with your spouse, and you go, okay, I'm out, right? I'm not ready to receive. I just actually really blew it, and I'm going to take a step back, and just not rush into that. Of course, that's a personal decision. As I mentioned this morning, the fasting is not a way to become worthy, but meaning it's not magic, not a formula, but it is a way of putting it on your sacraments calendar, right? In other words, you're actually planning to be there, and so you want to follow the guidelines of the church and not eat and drink. So I think that all of the prayers that lead up to, and then that last call with fear, with faith, and with love, ultimately you're invited to partake. The last thing thank you for that question, by the way, Bob, is that there was in the United States prior to, I guess, the 1970s, there was not frequent communion, at least within the Greek Orthodox and the Russian Orthodox Church, and this has changed due to some of the theological seminary teachings, but it had been a real dilemma of how does one. I'll just go on Nativity, Christmas, and on Easter with Pascha. That's when you would receive communion, and otherwise you wouldn't. And so that's been a change, to be willing to come for frequent communion. I will note that some of the Orthodox traditions, Russian and I think Bulgarian, especially Bulgarian, have frequent confession paired with coming to communion. And so in the Bulgarian church, I believe you have to have a confession before you receive communion, each time.
I raised the issue because so often when I would be speaking with someone who was evangelical, the word would come back, worthy? You can't be worthy. You're never worthy. And it's such an elusive quality, When can you say I am worthy? Maybe you can't say it.
Well, I think that's the grace, worthy through grace, and also there is this aspect of you've been invited, so you need to kind of get there. So I mean,
good way to put it.
Yeah, you kind of need to step into that space and ask for the help.
I think incidentally, it may be hard to know that you're worthy, but it's not all that hard to know you're unworthy. I mean, maybe the fight with your spouse is not quite it, but if you blatantly lied just an hour before church, or so it's the.
Would you assess that by sort of what you feel in terms of?
Yeah, I mean, if you're unworthy, you probably feel aware of it.
Yeah.
Well, my wife will tell me.
Yeah. Well, I think Helen brought up the wonderful passage from the Sermon on the Mount yesterday about, if you remember that your brother has something against you, that you set down your gift. So it's really there by Jesus already.
I wonder if anyone has ever acted on that, though.
Gone and taken care of it before they go take the sacrament?
Yes.
I have.
Oh.
Well, I mean, it sort of implies your gift is already on the altar, you're near the altar, but you realize something's wrong, and you leave.
You say, excuse me, I'll be back.
Yes, yeah,
Right.
you leave to go take care of it. But maybe some have.
Yeah.
Yeah, some have.
Yeah.
And that's good.
Yeah.
One of the communion prayers that in my parish, it's actually chanted by the choir as you're in the communion line is, "Let me not give you a kiss as did Judas, but like the thief, let me confess and I forget the rest of it. So it remembers the sort of the false intimacy of that kiss.
Yeah.
Because of course the person, the priests receive communion through the chalice. We receive the communion on a spoon with the combination of wine and bread. But nevertheless, the mouth is involved, and that's why the hymn is placed there, to not give a false intimacy. Yeah.
I want to thank you for mentioning Bulgarian Orthodoxy, because I thought I knew quite a bit about different branches of Orthodoxy.
Didn't know
but
that one, huh?
No one has ever spoken about the
Yeah.
unique theological emphases of Bulgarian Orthodoxy. Which leads me to ask, are there Orthodoxy dividing debates over these things? I mean,
Yeah, this is a question that I just recently had an opportunity to study, so I'm happy to answer. Is that there are, depending on how you count, there are either 14 or 15 so-called self-governing Orthodox churches that are affiliated with Constantinople and the Patriarch of Constantinople, and they're so-called autocephalous churches. But then that doesn't include some of the churches like the Coptic Orthodox or the Assyrian Orthodox. So there are some so-called non-Chalcedonian Orthodox churches that I've had students that belong to some of those churches, and they use the term Orthodox in their own names. But I guess technically speaking, the Chalcedonian churches are the ones that are affiliated with Constantinople as sort of first among equals. And yes, they do have different practices, but we consider ourselves to be in communion with each other so that we can go to each other's churches and receive communion. So dogmatically they're understood to be within the same tent, even though they have different booths.
Are there ways of policing? You go from a Bulgarian Orthodox congregation to, say, Russian Orthodox. Does somebody decide whether you are, or you're? It's just a matter. I mean, can you just jump the fence on your own, or?
Well, it's literally, it's like going from Massachusetts to New Hampshire. There's not a visa, meaning that you're still inside the communion. However, if you're in a parish, if I show up at a Bulgarian Orthodox church and I come to the communion line and the priest doesn't know me, he could actually say, where are you from? And because it depends on how strict things are. But yeah, And if I approached the Bulgarian church, they might ask me, when was my last confession? Yeah.
If you were Latter-day Saint, you might be asked by the leader of the congregation, do you temple recommend?
Yeah.
Because the questions that are asked with the temple recommend are almost like a catechism in terms of are you,
Yeah.
and you have that little recommend in your wallet and carry it with you everywhere.
Yeah.
It's similar to like taking a membership record or something.
Would there be a disqualifying period of absence of confession that would?
Say again?
I was wondering in Bruce's tradition if there's a disqualifying period of absence of confession. So if they answer the question, it's been a year or a month, would there be?
Yeah, it really, Carlos, it really varies. I mean, some of the traditions, and again, it's also different parts of the world, like have confession being more frequent, and so and in other parts, it's kind of lapsed. It's not as ubiquitously experienced. So it is a difference in at least in American Orthodoxy. I can say that within the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, it really varies. How frequently people have the sacrament of confession. Whereas in the Russian Orthodox, it tends to be, at least my experience is, it's still, alive and well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So what happens if your answer is not acceptable? What must you do?
This is rare. I mean, it's rare. Usually you don't want to embarrass someone in the communion line. But if you're, I've seen it only once where it was in a monastery and the abbot asked someone to, they gave him, I think they gave him some other bread and some water, holy water, but they didn't allow the person to receive. So they have a little consultation up there, and they say, no, I don't think so. But I've only seen that once. But
I recall in Catholic grade school where, you have the priest knows you so well that I have seen a priest pass over a young man once when he knew something had happened very recently
Just
that would have
walk right
precluded
past
his
him.
ability to partake. So he just stepped aside and went to the next parishioner.
I mean, in a
Deal with you later.
That's right. And you know what I mean.
I mean, in a pastoral setting, it's a very sensitive issue because
sure.
it's really a very private matter.
Yes.
But I think one just quick note is it would be impossible for me to overstate how important the Eucharist is for the life in Christ of Orthodox Christians. There's no textbook that can tell you how central it is, and so Peter, maybe you'll build on this with your work, but as someone that came into the Orthodox Church from being Southern Baptist as a young person, I continue to marvel at its centrality of your whole identity of being in liturgy. Is deeply ingrained and deeply satisfying. So I've been thinking this morning what would be apt metaphors to use for this, and I'm still working on it. I still haven't really come up with them, but I think that that list of benefits that I just gave you a sense in which that's almost a medicine for the soul. That it's not a once a year pill. You keep taking it.
Yeah, I think that kind of gets back to our earlier conversation that not just to you, Bruce, but for those of us who already presented and talked about communion, it's interesting why it's such an important part of our formation, but then it's still fenced and gated by only certain people that can participate. It's a bit of a dichotomy in some ways, right? Because you would think that whether you're a part of that church community or not, that you would see it as a avenue for growth or experience of faith, even though for those that's a part of that tradition has particular meaning as to why they come to the table. It's just an interesting kind of observation.
Yeah, and I've been thinking about that same question this morning because we haven't really spoken about the way in which the giving of the divine gifts is in fact a community making event, and it in fact defines the boundaries of the community. And I think it's in the Eucharistic prayers that are found in the Didache that speak about the bread with reference to unity, that even though it's divided, it's all one bread. And one of the elements that, these metaphors are many, but I think one of the elements that underlies the Eucharistic meal is unity of, and it's that which I think it's trying to kind of keep with respect to not allowing non-believers to receive. It is true that it's the benefits of the medicine are there, but there's also a community identity aspect to it, which we haven't really talked. It's not in our text, but I think that there's other texts that talk about that.
Bruce, what was the experience on Zoom I mean, I'm following up on the Eucharist being so central and key to Orthodox life. So what happens when that's no longer physically possible?
Yeah, our particular parish did not, when we were not able to meet at all, we actually, our priest and his daughter received communion for our entire parish, and we were watching via Zoom, so that there was still, rather than doing a link, a video, we were chanting and singing with them, although he was at his house. And then as soon as we had partial opening, then we were down to 20, 25 people that could come. But our community actually came closer together during this past year than it has been before, because we had more people singing in strange places from their couches and so forth. It was,
Yeah.
but you had mentioned, Cheryl, the idea of longing.
Yeah.
And I think that was an experience that almost a time of being away from each other, almost like, two married people who agree to be away for a time, is that the longing was received by God, I think, as a gift.
Wow.
That's, I think, how people were told to think about it. But I do think it was very hard for a lot of people.
This is, I know a naive question, but you talk about the reception of the body and blood of Christ into a person's life, then therefore their bodies become the temple of the Spirit. How much of that receiving of it is accompanied by understanding? I'm just trying to get there's a lot here about, let's say, the prayers and other elements of the liturgy are a preparation for receiving Christ in the sacrament. And I think, I'll probably say more about this later, but one of the critiques that people in my part of the Christian world very much against nominalism, and this especially gets used with the Orthodoxy in Eastern Europe, for example, that they just go through the mechanics of it, and they don't really, either they don't know what they're doing or they don't really pay attention to what they're doing. How much of that is genuine reception and offering hospitality with the result that they are more of a temple?
I think motifs that are emphasized every week in the liturgical prayers, I do think that it would be hard to avoid those theological truths. They won't know them from the Bible, but if they are like the idea of letting Christ come into our house, which is one of the prayers, after time, you start to think about your body as Christ living in you. But you're absolutely right, Robert. Richard. That there are lots of different levels of awareness, theological awareness, and but the importance of what they're doing is nevertheless very deep, and that's what I've come to appreciate, that especially what we call so-called cradle Orthodox, those that have never known a time when they weren't Orthodox. They develop almost a reflex towards the Eucharistic practice that means a lot to them, and they know that Christ is this. It's a way of communing with Christ, but they may not have a lot of theological language around it. And the most scripture that they may know is the scripture that's actually in the liturgy. but then the range is all the way up. And I think that I think we experience this in almost everything, though. I mean, films, movies, people may get the deep meanings, and others just like the chase scenes. We have different levels of appreciation, but I have come to appreciate so much the deep lived experience of people that have been in the church so much longer than me. And I'm still learning what it's like to be a member.
So in many ways, it's, to use the very contemporary sort of Protestant kind of language, they're drawn into the narrative of it. They're finding their place in a narrative, even though they may not be able to explain a lot of aspects of it.
Yeah, they experience the 12 feasts of Jesus' life and Mary's life through year after year after year, and then Holy Week is like a whole year in itself.
Yeah.
And so when you do that, 30, 40 years, you become. It is a as you said, it's a narrative that you are part of, and but it doesn't mean that they could necessarily articulate, what all that means. But
Great, thank you, Bruce. And we
My
can
pleasure.
continue this conversation here a little bit later. But we want to leave some time for Richard Mao to talk to us about a little bit about the evangelical tradition, and we'll try to wrap by 4:40 with our discussion aspect, after which we'll take a brief break.
I have to make a lot of confessions.
But you need to be worthy to
We-
teach us.
We do.
Because I don't want to report unworthily. But when I first looked at text with this project in mind, I thought, oh gosh, the liturgical types are going to go wild on this one. Yeah. So I decided I would,
who are
as
those?
boldly as I could with integrity.
Start with Emerson, yeah.
And it just so happened that I was reading Emerson. And, in a profound sense, I think it's kind of odd to pair Emerson and Spurgeon, beyond just saying they both lived in the 19th century. But they both were, Emerson just very dramatically just saying, I don't want to be involved in this Eucharist type thing anymore, Whereas, can you all hear that? Oh, I'm sorry. But whereas the potential spam
I never get those.
I never get notice of that.
from Nigeria too. But but they were both negating the effectiveness of the sacrament without paying very special attention. And I was so glad you quoted St. John Chrysostom on this, because I think his point is one that my people would greatly appreciate, and that is that the proper way of receiving Christ and thinking metaphorically of eating and drinking the body and blood of Christ is to receive his teachings and to be in the faith in him, And so that if you can think of, going back to the nominalism thing, if you can think of what it means to go through that mechanically without any awareness of what it means or any concern about what it means, but just as going through a mere ritual, and even Alexander Schmemann could allow for mere ritual, as you've pointed out, then whatever is missing in there is really seen as terribly important. So that even in my strand of the Reformed tradition that has tended to read a passage like this polemically, and this is one thing I've learned a lot from in this group, that the ways in which we read these passages are very much shaped by the polemics that our communities have experienced. So that right away, John Calvin sees that, he says, it's not about the Eucharist, you know? It's about receiving Christ and flourishing in the way of life and in the assurance of salvation and the like. And then Calvin says, not that we shouldn't eat the body and blood of Christ, but that's the fruit of something else that we get through the proclamation of the word. And so that when Howard Hageman, who had been the president of New Brunswick Seminary, a Reformed theologian, became very disappointed in the ways in which typical Reformed and Presbyterian congregations failed to see the importance of the table. And he gave those stone lectures at Princeton. They were entitled Word and Table. I mean, the idea that the word, for Emerson, it was only the word as he understood what the word was. For Spurgeon, you have communion, but the important thing is hearing the word and allowing it to enter into and to nurture the faith in your life. And Calvin is already saying that in the Reformation period, that it's the word, the proclaimed word, that really does it. Hearing and believing and growing in the faith of what you have heard. And then the sacrament is kind of supplemental to that in some sense, and an important supplement. So that the Mercersburg theology, which was the more of a merger of Anglican and Reformed theology, was still very word and sacrament, word and sacrament. And that's very, that the insistence on word and table, word and sacrament is, and somebody, I don't know if we're joking or not, but the thief on the cross is kind of, in many ways, a paradigm for us. He just heard Jesus say something to him, or he recognized something about the person and work of Christ, and perhaps even just minimal. But Christ could assure him that he will be with me in paradise. And we sort of take that, and I'll just, I've said my thing here, but I had a big argument with Jim, my good friend Jim Heff, at USC, and I used the example of a real story that I'd heard, a testimony. This guy is a traveling salesman. He commits adultery all the time. He drinks too much. And one night he's in the Holiday Inn, and he just doesn't feel like going down to the bar. And he opens the drawer, and there's the Gideon Bible, and he opens it up and says, feeling discouraged, read such and such. Feeling guilty, read such and such. And he just reads enough to just get down on his knees and says, God, I don't know quite what all this means, but I accept Christ. And I say, that's it. I mean, he's in. And he goes home and he apologizes to his wife and confesses his sins, and they get involved in a church, But I said, that moment in the hotel room when he's gotten up off his knees, I said this to Jim, don't you agree that that's in? I mean, if the thief on the cross was in, this guy was probably doing. And then Jim said, I'd have to wait and see, And one of the things that he wanted to wait and see was whether or not he entered into the sacramental life of the church. And I understand the argument, but we don't see the thief on the cross as some kind of big theological exception, abnormality, but that there's something about responding to the word, and the church was there in that room. the Gideon Bible, you know. They were present in that. He responded to the message of the church based on the scriptures. And that, I think that's a big issue in all of this. To what degree is that not quite enough, or maybe God granted an exception, or whether that captures something about what it means to have reached out to Christ in faith. So, yeah, I mean that's the case, and I was even willing to expose one of my heroes, Charles Spurgeon, for having been, referring to idiots, and you know, that's terrible. And I apologize. But the point that he's making is that to feed on Christ is to hear the word about him and respond in faith, which will then lead you into a sacramental life. And then the more exegetical side of this is that this is one of the I am. And the I am divine doesn't mean, I don't know whether some of you think it is, but I don't think it's about drinking wine at communion. I think he's talking about the unity of the church. He's using an image there. And so it may very well be that the bread image, the bread metaphor, doesn't have to be taken as a Eucharistic reference. And I would argue that it isn't. That's not to deny that there aren't other things in the scriptures on this, but that's the case.
Officially, you may start asking Rich questions.
Yeah, Rich, maybe just to build off of that, not surprised that you would make that argument from the Reformed tradition. Strong focus on the word as central.
Yeah.
Right? And understandably so. I guess it does represent a certain kind of epistemology and a certain kind of view of revelation that, taking kind of the other perspective, you could say that's a bit limited in its scope, that it's only focused on the proclamation of the gospel. I don't hear you saying that, but that could be perceived that way, right? And so, not to nullify the other practice, whether it be the Eucharist or other forms of ways in which we encounter God. I know that you wouldn't deny those, but I'd be interested. You know, I read your paper and I saw you took that position, which I agree that the passage doesn't speak specifically about the Eucharistic practice. I guess maybe when it comes to, I know it's hard to speak for all evangelicals here, but from your evangelical tradition, would you think that would still be a pretty predominant view that you've just outlined regarding still the proclamation of the gospel?
Yeah, yeah. I think the closest that we could come together, many of us on this, and I could join in, is the importance of word and sacrament, and not just word. You know. But if you're gonna de-emphasize one of them, we'd go with the sacrament.
Right.
To
Sure.
de-emphasize.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it's an epistemological issue, though. I mean, I don't know that I want to put the whole receiving the word in cognitive terms. You know, I think that the child. I mean, I as a little kid, you know, Paul says to Timothy, as a child thou hast known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise unto salvation. And I think the famous Karl Barth example there is, you know, when you sing Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. That's rich. That's a rich appropriation of the gospel without maybe being articulating a doctrine of the Trinity or atonement theory or anything else. You know.
Yeah, I guess I was saying epistemologically because it could be perceived as the proclamation is primarily much more of a telling of truth or cognitive focus, whereas you could say that the table gives you a much more kind of mystical, experiential component. Again, we're making categories there; they don't quite work. But that was the rationale for that statement.
I'm glad you moved in that direction, Mark, and it's providential that Bruce went first and then Rich, and so we can build on all of this. Just one comment to you, Mark. I think you could make the case that the actions of the Eucharist, which are accompanied by words, can proclaim themselves. And it'd be hard to say exactly where proclamation of the word stops and celebration of the sacrament begins, especially since words are part of it, and there is an implied narrative, and et cetera. So I think that's one further step in that direction. But I wonder, Rich, if we said, let's not talk Christian theology for a while, let's pause that, and do anthropology. Right? Just look at the traditions that we represent as an anthropologist would, and start with Bruce's tradition. Those instincts that you initially were talking about, that deep sense of sacramentality, those have been building up for centuries, and they were really mature in the first Christian millennium. And they have continued, but I don't know if anything significantly has really developed in terms of the instincts since then. And I'm not saying that people are taking the easy way out and not doing their work, but really the maturity of that sensibility has been achieved. Whereas, the evangelical tradition in general, although it's rooted in the Reformation, really has been so influenced by the categories of the Enlightenment. And it's hard to go back, so the Enlightenment is carried with the evangelical tradition, like it or not. And so back to epistemology, you talk about receiving the word, meaning understanding the word. Do we mean something different when we say that as opposed to what, say, Calvin said? Pre-Enlightenment, but still sort of early modern. So my anthropologist friend might say, skip, just pause theology a moment. Just look at how these traditions of human beings, how have developed, and one is rooted in the ancient world. One looks to the ancient world, uses ancient scriptures, of course, etc., but really has been formed by the instincts of the early modern world. So what do you think about that?
Well, yes, I think we really need to sort all that out. I'm a little suspicious of too loose a use of the word enlightenment or modernity. I think that gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah.
If the Enlightenment ideology, which we are now, as McIntyre and others have thought as post-Enlightenment, is that reason is the highest standard of truth in the universe, and therefore the highest faculty of the human person. It seems to me that the Puritan tradition is very affective.
Yeah.
Holiness tradition is very affective.
Yeah, and let's use a broad definition of enlightenment and say Jonathan Edwards style.
Yeah.
Not.
And I think Jonathan Edwards was probably much more influenced by John Locke and Bishop Berkeley philosophically, epistemologically, than a lot of people in the Reformed tradition.
Yeah.
And I think the old Princeton with Scottish Enlightenment
Yeah.
philosophy. But I'm just not I'm not ready to go there on that because the anti-intellectualism of the evangelical tradition, which was so strong, beginning mid-19th century with the evolutionary controversy, and pretty soon you went from we're against evolution to we're against science to we're against worldly thinking. And Bible Institute says practical training rather than, you know. I'm not sure how much of that, I mean, people have said, well, you know, the doctrine of inerrancy of Scripture is very much an Enlightenment kind of thing, but I've never been quite as convinced of that. And incidentally, I did read Ratzinger recently, who said, let's not condemn everything about the Enlightenment.
Right.
Either. So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
but I do want to sort all that out. I'm with you on that, but I'm not ready to.
And for me, just those brief comments represent a long-term project, unfinished. You know, between my ears.
Yeah.
I may have talked to you about this before, but I read something, 20 plus years ago, that Randy Ballmer had written. He said his characterization.
He sort of travels with Charlie around the evangelical world. Is that the one?
Yes, that's
Word
the
of Life camp and all that.
He said he grew up evangelical. He said, I'm fearful that what took place is that in the early 20th century, when evangelicals found themselves rather being beaten up by science, etc., he said, what did they do? What did we do, he said? We sent our best and our brightest to the great universities of the world. And then he said, and they came back equipped with an Enlightenment mindset. Consequently, when I've often thought about myself, why is it Mormons are so feelings conscious, and why is it evangelicals are concerned about that? He said, I fear that if we're not careful, evangelicalism will lose the pietistic dimension of faith. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
Because everything is a proof. You know, it's what's the name of the book? Evidence that demands a verdict.
Yeah.
Right.
Although I would
Josh
say,
McDonough.
just something we can talk about more, but I find Brigham Young with the eternality of intelligence as, I think, the Latter-day Saint theology pretty grounded in enlightenment.
Yeah, I agree.
Even though you don't like the Greek intrusion at Nicaea, you
That's
still.
the darn Greek influence really ruins it, didn't it?
But I do think this is fascinating. I mean, this whole area of anthropology, as you say, I think this is pretty fundamental. A lot of us in the Reformed tradition see Calvinism as much more will-oriented. You turn your will toward God, and it's the way your will is directed shapes the way you think and the way you feel, even. So if you take the sort of affective, cognitive, volitional will is the primacy of the will is very important. Hour of decision.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question or conversation topic around Richard's paper.
Do you think Spurgeon oversaid it?
Yeah, he does. I mean, when I started college, my parents gave me 20 volumes of Spurgeon's sermons, and I've actually, over my lifetime, I've read all of them. And he goes into anti-Catholic, orthodoxy isn't a part of his world, but the anti-Catholic. And
Never is.
But his main concern is, he'll describe something like Fatima. I mean, it isn't Fatima, but I mean, something like that, where people are willing to crawl on their hands and knees, for miles, getting their knee bloody, rather than simply accepting the gospel. So it's faith works and going through the motions of things and relying on rituals rather than, as he sees it, yielding the will to Christ. Mm-hmm. And it's always there's always a lot of false choice in rhetoric. But there's a part of him that at times, as in that lovely description of the Mass in Belgium, where
The priest, the kind.
That's very tender, very touching.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, it was, I thought, a very affectionate kind of thing, and he's not even requiring that the guy use the right theological language, He never talked about justification by faith, but it certainly fit with that,
He kind of slips into his old ways near the end, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the strong wind of popery and all of that.
Tell me most winsome sentence.
But let me at least feel like I vindicated his spirit at least a little bit.
I appreciate him as he is. And Emerson, too. I'm glad Emerson is in there because he's a representative of trajectory.
Of a continuum, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Incidentally, a totally different subject, but I once did 2 weeks in Concord, and my project was to work on the Harvard Divinity Hall. But for some reason, I went to the cemetery, and his daughter, Ellen, her tombstone says she loved the old faith. And she was a Sunday school teacher at First Unitarian Church long after her father quit all of that. And her theology was Arian, basically. But she would say things like, we had the most, Mother and I had the most wonderful Bible study this evening. We're going through Galatians together. And she went with her dad to London, and she wrote to her mother, Father, the priest preached the gospel.
Yes.
And Father listened carefully, and we need to be praying, And it was this interesting. And then when I found out that Nathaniel Hawthorne's daughter became the head of a Catholic religious order, I'm thinking, what in the world? The women of Concord, interesting stuff.
Yeah, there is that trajectory.
Yeah, and for some reason we think we know all about the 19th century, but you open just a few books and you realize there's so much we don't know about Christian Unitarianism and about the appeal of Catholicism to certain Americans.
Wealthy literary women, yeah.
Well, I read William Ellery Channing and think this is good stuff.
Yes.
Now, not necessarily what became of that.
All right. Well, this is great. Let's keep going, but not right now. We're gonna pause for a break. So we'll pick back up. So those of you who will be following along either in person or online, we're gonna have a short 20-minute break, and then we'll be picking back up at 5 o'clock here, and we'll have our last two traditions being discussed. Following that, we'll have a Q&A from the in-person audience here. So we'll see you back here at a little after 5. Thanks.